In the first months of 2025, Keanu Reeves wasn't where most people expected him to be. He wasn't on a red carpet, flashing that familiar half-smile under the glare of camera lights. He wasn't giving interviews about his latest role or promoting a new project with rehearsed charm. Instead, he was walking, just walking, along a narrow dirt trail that wound through the hills above Big Sur, boots scuffed, hands tucked into the pockets of a well-worn jacket, the Pacific Ocean stretching out far below like a sheet of hammered silver. It had been a long stretch of work. Back-to-back films, international press tours, the kind of schedule that leaves even the most seasoned professionals feeling hollowed out. But for Keanu, it wasn't exhaustion that drove him away. It was something quieter, deeper, a sense that he'd been talking too much, doing too much, and listening too little. Not to other people necessarily, but to himself. To the part of him that didn't need to perform, explain, or justify. He'd rented a small cabin, the kind with creaky floorboards and windows that fogged in the morning. No Wi-Fi, no television, just books stacked on a wooden table, a kettle on the stove, and a view that changed with the light. Mornings began with coffee and silence. Sometimes he'd sit on the porch for an hour, watching fog roll in off the ocean, listening to the wind move through the redwoods. Other days he'd hike until his legs ached, not to reach a destination but just to move, to feel his body grounded in the world while his mind untangled itself. People who knew him weren't surprised. They'd seen this pattern before. After big losses, after intense projects, after moments of public attention that felt too bright, too loud, he'd disappear for a while. Not dramatically, not as an act, but as a quiet necessity. Like a tree shedding leaves in autumn, not because it's broken, but because it knows how to survive the winter. His phone stayed mostly off. When it did ring, it was usually someone close, a longtime friend, a collaborator from decades past. They never pushed. They'd leave a message. "Hey, just checking in. No need to reply." And he appreciated that. The space to be absent without apology. One afternoon, sitting on a sun-warmed rock overlooking a hidden cove, he thought about how strange it was that silence had become a kind of rebellion. In a world that demanded constant output, posts, opinions, reactions, updates, choosing to say nothing felt almost radical. But it wasn't about rejecting the world. It was about making room for something real to grow. He remembered a conversation from years ago with an old mentor who'd worked in theater. The man had said, "Most people are so afraid of silence they'll fill it with noise just to prove they're alive. But the truth is, silence is where life speaks loudest." At the time, Keanu hadn't fully understood. Now, sitting alone with the sound of waves and wind, it made perfect sense. He wasn't meditating in any formal way. He wasn't following a guru or quoting ancient texts. He was just being still. And in that stillness, things began to settle, not because he forced them to, but because he stopped interfering. Grief he'd carried for years softened at the edges. Questions he'd been wrestling with didn't get answers exactly, but they lost their sharpness. He realized he didn't need to solve everything. Sometimes just holding a feeling gently was enough. Back in the cabin, he started writing again. Not scripts, not letters, just thoughts. Short lines in a notebook. Patience isn't waiting. It's trusting. The river doesn't rush, but it always arrives. He didn't plan to show them to anyone. They were just markers, like stones left along a path to help him find his way back if he ever got lost again. Evenings were simple, a bowl of soup. A book, often poetry, sometimes philosophy, occasionally a dog-eared novel he'd read before. He liked the rhythm of returning to familiar pages, finding new meaning in old sentences. There was comfort in that. A reminder that understanding isn't a straight line. One night, a storm rolled in. Rain tapped against the roof like fingers drumming softly. He lit a single lamp and sat by the window, watching lightning flicker over the ocean. In that moment, he felt completely alone and completely at peace. Not lonely, but whole. It was a rare feeling, one he'd learned not to chase, only to welcome when it came. He thought about the people in his life, the ones he'd lost, the ones still here, the ones he'd yet to meet. He missed them, yes, but the missing didn't hurt the way it used to. It had become part of him, like the lines on his face or the way his voice had deepened with time. Love didn't disappear when someone was gone. It just changed shape. A few days later, he walked into a small coastal town for supplies. The locals knew him by now, but they didn't make a fuss. The woman at the general store nodded and handed him a paper bag with bread and eggs. "Quiet week?" she asked. He smiled. "The best kind." She understood. In places like this, silence wasn't emptiness. It was respect. Back on the trail, he passed a young couple arguing in hushed, tense voices. He didn't eavesdrop, but he noticed how their bodies were turned away from each other, how their eyes darted everywhere but at one another. He remembered times like that in his own life, when words had failed, when trying to fix things only made them worse. Later he wondered if they'd find their way back to each other. He hoped they'd give themselves the space to breathe. He wasn't trying to be a symbol or a lesson. He was just a man trying to live honestly. But in doing so, he was practicing something rare: presence. Not the kind you perform for an audience, but the kind you offer to yourself. The kind that says, "I'm here, I don't have all the answers, and that's okay." As February turned to March, the days grew longer. The fog lifted earlier each morning. Wildflowers began to push through the damp earth. He noticed these changes not because he was looking for them, but because he was paying attention. And that, he realized, was the heart of it all. Attention, not distraction, not reaction. Just paying attention to what is without rushing to change it. He still didn't know what came next. No grand plan, no announcement. But for the first time in a while, that didn't scare him. He'd learned that life doesn't always need a script. Sometimes it just needs you to show up and stay quiet long enough to hear what it's trying to say. And so he walked, step by step, breath by breath, letting the world move around him while he stayed still inside. Not hiding, not escaping, just being. Because in that stillness something important was happening, something he couldn't name but could feel, like seeds underground, waiting for the right moment to rise. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a plain manila envelope with no return address. Just a post office box in Vancouver and a handwritten note on the front that read, "For Keanu if he's willing to listen." He'd been back in the city for less than a week, staying in a modest apartment above a bookstore, easing back into the rhythm of sidewalks and street noise after months of wind and waves. The envelope sat on his kitchen table for 2 days before he opened it. He wasn't avoiding it, he just liked to let things settle. Emails, calls, even mail. If it was urgent, it would find its way. If not, it could wait. But something about the weight of the paper, the care in the handwriting, made him curious. Inside was a single sheet, typed but with smudges that suggested it had been revised by hand. It began simply, "We don't need a celebrity. We need a human." The note explained that a small nonprofit, founded by a former teacher and a youth counselor, was hosting a gathering for teenagers struggling with anxiety, isolation, and the constant pressure of being on in a digital world. They met weekly in a converted community center near Stanley Park. No branding. No social media. Just a safe room, warm tea, and honest conversation. They'd seen how Keanu carried himself over the years. Not the headlines, but the quiet gestures, the way he'd sit with crew members on set long after wrap, the stories of him giving up his seat on a plane, the times he'd shown up at hospitals or shelters without fanfare. They weren't asking for a speech. Not really, just his presence. Maybe a few words if he felt moved, but only if he came as himself, not as a star but as someone who understood what it meant to carry pain and still choose kindness. And there was one condition they emphasized: no cameras. No press, no recordings unless everyone in the room agreed. This wasn't an event to be broadcast. It was a moment to be shared. Keanu read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He didn't respond right away. He walked to the park instead, sat on a bench beneath a cherry tree just beginning to bloom, and watched kids skateboard, couples stroll, a man feeding pigeons with crumbs from his pocket. He thought about what it meant to be seen, not for your fame but for your humanity, and what it meant to show up when you weren't sure you had anything to offer. That night he called the number at the bottom of the page. A woman answered on the third ring, her voice calm, slightly tired, like someone used to holding space for others. He didn't introduce himself with fanfare. Just said, "Hi, this is Keanu, I got your letter." There was a pause, just a breath, and then she said, "Oh, thank you for calling." They talked for nearly an hour. Not about logistics, not about schedules, but about why this mattered. She told him about the kids, the ones who hadn't spoken in weeks, the ones who cried in the bathroom at school, the ones who scrolled endlessly at 3 a.m. trying to feel less alone. She said they didn't need solutions. They needed witnesses, people who could sit with them in the dark without rushing to turn on the lights. Keanu listened. He didn't offer advice. He just said, "I've been in that dark too." When he hung up, he felt a familiar tug. Not excitement, not duty, but resonance. Like a tuning fork struck softly in another room. He knew this wasn't about being helpful in the usual sense. It was about being real. Still, he hesitated. He'd learned the hard way that good intentions could backfire, that even the purest moments could be twisted, edited, turned into content. He remembered times when a quiet act of compassion had been blown up into a headline, stripped of its meaning, used to sell something. He didn't want that for these kids. Or for himself. So he called back the next morning. "If I come," he said, "I need to know it stays between us." No photos, no quotes online. If someone wants to share what's said, they do it with their own words in their own time. Not because it's trending. She agreed without hesitation. "That's exactly how we run things," she said. "This isn't about you. It's about them feeling safe enough to be themselves." That settled it. He booked a flight for the following week. Not first class, just a window seat and coach, hat pulled low, headphones on. The kind of travel most people wouldn't notice. At the airport, a teenager recognized him and froze mid-step, eyes wide. Keanu gave a small nod, not dismissive, just quiet. The kid smiled nervously and walked on. No selfie, no demand. Just a shared moment of recognition, then space. In Vancouver, he stayed in a guest room above the community center, simple, clean, with a view of the garden. The staff treated him like any other visitor. They offered tea, showed him where the towels were, and left him alone. No fuss, no hovering. It felt like coming home to a place he'd never been. The night before the gathering, he walked through the park as dusk fell. The air smelled of damp earth and salt. He passed a group of teens sitting on a bench laughing over something on a phone. One of them looked up, saw him, and did a double take. But instead of pulling out a camera, she just whispered something to her friend and they both grinned, then went back to their conversation. It was the kind of reaction he appreciated, acknowledgement without intrusion. Back at the center, he met the team, 5 people, all in their 30s and 40s, who'd left corporate jobs or teaching posts to build this space. They weren't idealists in the flashy sense. They were tired, committed, and deeply human. Over a shared meal of lentil soup and bread, they talked about burnout, hope, and the quiet courage it takes to keep showing up for others when the world feels broken. No one asked him for stories from movie sets. No one mentioned box office numbers. They asked how he was sleeping, if he'd been able to rest, if he felt ready. He admitted he was nervous. "I don't want to say the wrong thing," he said. One of the counselors, a man with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers, replied, "You won't. Just be where your feet are. That's enough." The next afternoon, the room filled slowly, chairs arranged in a loose circle, soft lighting, a kettle steaming on a side table, blankets folded neatly in a basket. The teens came in ones and twos, some with parents, most alone. They ranged in age from 14 to 18. Some wore hoodies pulled tight around their faces. Others made eye contact, tentative but curious. Keanu didn't stand apart. He took a seat like everyone else near the window, hands resting on his knees. He didn't introduce himself with a title or a resume. When the facilitator welcomed everyone and mentioned he'd be joining them, he simply said, "Thanks for having me." There was no agenda, no PowerPoint, no script, just conversation. Someone asked how he dealt with pressure. He didn't talk about Hollywood. He talked about learning to breathe when his chest felt tight, about walking away when things got too loud, about how sometimes doing nothing was the bravest thing he could do. Another asked if he ever felt like a fraud. He nodded. "All the time," he said. But I've learned that feeling doesn't mean it's true. A girl in the back, barely audible, asked, "How do you stop hating yourself when everything feels wrong?" The room went still. Not out of discomfort, but out of shared understanding. Keanu looked at her, not with pity, but with the kind of attention that says, "I see you and you're not alone." "I don't know if you ever fully stop," he said gently. "But you can learn to be kinder to yourself. Like you would with a friend. You wouldn't yell at a friend for being sad. So why do it to yourself?" She didn't answer, but she sat up a little straighter. As the hours passed, the tension in the room softened. Laughter came easier. Shoulders relaxed. Someone brought out cookies. Another played a song on a small speaker, something soft, acoustic. Keanu didn't dominate the conversation. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, it wasn't to fix, but to reflect. To say, "Yeah, I've been there too." By the time the sun dipped below the trees, something had shifted. Not because of him, but because of the space they'd all created together. A space where silence wasn't awkward, where questions didn't need answers, where just being present was enough. As people began to leave, a few stopped to thank him. Not for being famous, but for being real. One boy shook his hand and said, "You made it feel okay to not be okay." Keanu squeezed his shoulder. "It always is." Later, walking back to his room, he felt tired in the best way. The kind that comes from giving something true, not from performing. He knew this wouldn't make headlines. It wouldn't go viral. And that was exactly why it mattered. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer isn't a solution. It's your silence, and your willingness to sit in it, with others. The rain started just after lunch, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the roof of the community center like a quiet heartbeat. Inside, the room felt warm, wrapped in the kind of calm that only comes when people stop pretending and start being. Keanu sat in the same spot as the day before, near the window where the gray light filtered through rain-streaked glass. He hadn't planned to stay more than one afternoon, but something about the way the group had opened up, the raw honesty, the lack of performance, made him want to linger. He wasn't there as a guest speaker. He was there as a person, and that made all the difference. The facilitator began the session the same way she always did, by lighting a small candle in the center of the circle and saying, "Today, we don't have to fix anything. We just have to be here. No agenda, no icebreakers. Just presence." A few new faces had joined. Two girls who hovered near the door at first, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like they were checking for exits. But as the others settled in, chatting softly over mugs of tea, they slowly moved toward the circle and took empty chairs. No one pressured them to talk. No one even looked at them too long. That alone seemed to ease something in their posture. Keanu watched them the way he'd learned to watch rivers, without expectation, just noticing how they moved. He remembered being that age, feeling like the world was watching but never really seeing him. Fame hadn't changed that feeling, it had just made it louder, more public. But here in this room, no one cared about his movies. They cared about whether he understood what it felt like to wake up and not want to face the day. After a while, one of the boys from the day before, a lanky kid with headphones always around his neck, spoke up. "Yesterday after you left," he said, glancing at Keanu, "I went home and just sat in my room. Didn't scroll. Didn't text. Just sat, and it was weird, but it didn't feel bad." Keanu nodded. Sometimes doing nothing is the hardest thing and the most healing. That opened the floodgates. Someone else admitted they'd cried in the school bathroom that morning because they felt invisible. Another said they kept apologizing for existing. A girl with bright blue hair whispered, "I don't know who I am when no one's watching." No one rushed to cheer them up. No toxic positivity. No just think happy thoughts. Instead, people nodded, said "me too," or simply held the silence with them. Then, without warning, Keanu leaned forward slightly and began to speak, not in a speech, not in a performance, but like someone sharing a secret over coffee late at night. He told them about a time years ago, after losing someone he loved deeply, when he couldn't speak for days. Not because he didn't want to, but because words felt like stones in his throat. He'd walk for hours through empty streets not to escape, but to feel the weight of his own footsteps. "I thought if I stayed still, the pain would crush me," he said. "But I learned something. Pain doesn't go away when you run. It goes away when you let it sit with you, when you stop fighting it." He paused, looked around the circle. Silence isn't empty. It's full of everything you've been too busy to feel. One of the new girls, the one who'd been hovering by the door, finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. But what if the silence is scary? Keanu didn't flinch. It is, he said. At first. Because in the silence you hear all the things you've been drowning out. The doubts, the regrets, the questions with no answers. But that's also where you start to hear yourself. Your real voice. Not the one you use to please people or fit in. The one that knows what you need even if you don't understand it yet. He told them about watching a river once high in the mountains. It wasn't rushing. It wasn't trying to get anywhere. It just flowed around rocks, over roots, under fallen branches. And yet it always reached the sea. You don't have to force your life to move, he said. You just have to trust that it's moving even when you can't see it. A long silence followed. Not awkward, not heavy, just full, like the room was breathing together. Then someone asked, "How do you stay kind when the world feels so harsh?" Keanu smiled faintly. By remembering that everyone is fighting something you can't see. Even the people who seem fine. Even the ones who hurt you. That doesn't excuse bad behavior. But it helps you not carry their pain as your own. He didn't offer quick fixes. He didn't promise that everything would work out. What he offered was something rarer. Permission. Permission to not have it all figured out. Permission to rest. Permission to be quiet. As the afternoon wore on, the rain eased. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. Someone brought out a guitar and played a simple melody. No lyrics, just notes that hung in the air like breath. Others closed their eyes. One girl curled up on a cushion, pulling a blanket over her shoulders like she hadn't slept in weeks. Keanu stayed quiet then, letting the music and the rain and the shared stillness do the talking. He watched the way the light touched each face, how the tension in their jaws softened, how their hands unclenched, how they leaned into the moment instead of bracing against it. This wasn't therapy. It wasn't a seminar. It was something older, simpler. Human beings remembering how to be together without masks. Later, during a break, the facilitator handed him a cup of tea. "You didn't have to say all that," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. "But I wanted to," she nodded. They needed to hear it from someone who meant it. He looked around the room, at the kids laughing over a shared snack, at the one who'd been silent finally asking a question, at the way the candlelight flickered in their eyes. I think I needed to say it too. When the session ended, no one rushed to leave. They lingered, talking in small groups, exchanging numbers, promising to meet next week. One boy walked over to Keanu and said, "My mom always says just be patient." But I never knew what that really meant until today. Keanu clapped him lightly on the shoulder. Patience isn't waiting for things to get better. It's trusting that you're exactly where you need to be, even in the mess. As he walked back to his room that evening, the streets glistened from the rain. The air smelled clean, fresh, like the world had taken a deep breath and let it out. He felt tired but not drained. The kind of tired that comes from giving something real, not from performing. He didn't know it yet, but something had shifted, not just in that room, but in the way his words would ripple outward. Someone would record a short audio clip on their phone, with everyone's permission, not for fame, not for clicks, just because they wanted to remember, but that was for later. For now, in the quiet of his room, Keanu sat by the window again, listening to the distant sound of the ocean. He thought about how strange it was that the most powerful moments in life often happen in silence. No fanfare, no audience, just two people or a circle of strangers, choosing to be real. And in that stillness, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because he wasn't trying to fix it. He was just letting it be. And somehow, that was enough. Weeks passed. The rain in Vancouver gave way to soft spring sun, and the cherry blossoms that had been tight buds during Keanu's visit now drifted like pink snow onto sidewalks and bike paths. Life in the city moved on. Buses rumbled, students hurried to class, coffee shops filled with the usual morning rush. Nothing seemed different on the surface, but something had shifted beneath it all, quiet and steady, like a stone dropped into a pond, whose ripples were only just beginning to reach the shore. It started with a voice memo. One of the teens from the gathering, someone who'd barely spoken the first day but had stayed until the very end, had asked the group if it was okay to record a few minutes of what Keanu shared. Not the whole session, just the part about silence, about rivers, about trusting that life moves even when you're still. Everyone agreed. There was no sense of performance, no thought of an audience beyond the room. It was simply a way to hold on to something that had felt true. A few days later, the teen sent the audio to a teacher they trusted, a high school counselor who ran a small mental wellness group during lunch breaks. The counselor listened alone in her office after school, headphones on, eyes closed. When it ended, she sat still for a long time. Then she played it again. She didn't post it online right away. She waited, thought about it, talked to the student, got permission from the community center and through them from Keanu himself, who, when asked, simply said, "If it helps someone, then yes." So she uploaded it. Not to a flashy channel, not with dramatic thumbnails or clickbait titles, just a plain post on a modest educational platform used by teachers and counselors across the country. She titled it, "Stay in silence and everything will occur naturally." Below it, a short note. Shared with permission. For anyone who needs to hear this today. At first, nothing happened. A few listens, a couple of shares among colleagues. Then a teacher in Oregon played it for her students during a quiet Friday afternoon. One of them recorded a short reaction, not dramatic, just honest, and posted it to a small account. Someone else quoted a line in a post about burnout, then another, and another. Within 3 weeks, the audio had been shared over 200,000 times. Not because it was polished, not because it was viral content, but because it felt real. In a world of curated feeds and rehearsed personas, here was something raw and unguarded. A voice speaking gently about pain, patience, and the courage to do nothing. People didn't just listen. They saved it. They played it before bed. They sent it to friends going through hard times with a simple message. "This reminded me of you." Therapists began using it in sessions, not as a cure, but as a starting point, a way to open conversations about stillness in a culture that glorifies constant motion. A nurse in Montreal started playing it during staff breaks at the hospital, saying it helped her team breathe again after long shifts. A librarian in Chicago printed out the transcript and left copies in the teen section with a note, "For when the noise gets too loud." And through all of it, Keanu said nothing. He was back on set by then, working on a new film in New Mexico. Long days, early calls, the familiar rhythm of lights, cameras, action. But something felt different. Crew members noticed he seemed calmer, more present. He took time between takes to walk alone, not on his phone, just looking at the desert sky. He asked how people were doing and really listened to the answer. One afternoon, a young production assistant nervously approached him during lunch. I heard that thing you said in Vancouver," she began, fiddling with her lanyard. "About silence. My sister's been really down lately and I played it for her. She cried, but like, the good kind." Keanu didn't smile for the camera or make a joke. He just looked at her and said, "Thank you for telling me." That was it. No grand statement. No follow-up. But the assistant walked away feeling like she'd been seen. Not as a fan, but as someone carrying love for someone else. Back online, the audio kept spreading, not through algorithms, but through human hands. A musician in Oslo wove a few lines into a song, crediting the source. A poet in Toronto wrote a piece inspired by it and read it at an open mic night. A high school in Ohio started a silent lunch once a week, where students could sit together without phones, just eating and being. They called it the Keanu Hour, though no one had asked him for that and he never claimed it. He didn't check the numbers. Didn't read the comments. He knew better than to let the noise of reaction drown out the quiet of intention. What mattered wasn't how many people heard it. It was whether it landed where it was needed. Still, small signs reached him. A handwritten letter slipped under his trailer door. "You said the thing I didn't know I needed to hear." A crew member mentioning that his teenage daughter had played the audio at her school's wellness club. Even the director, during a quiet moment between scenes, said, "Whatever you're carrying these days, it's showing up in your work." In a good way. Keanu just nodded. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Because the truth was he hadn't set out to inspire anyone. He'd simply shown up as himself, flawed, uncertain, human, and spoken from a place of honesty. And in doing so, He'd reminded others that they didn't have to be perfect to be worthy. That stillness wasn't laziness. That silence wasn't emptiness, it was space. Space to heal, space to grow, space to just be. One evening, after a long shoot, he sat alone in his trailer with a cup of tea. The desert wind tapped gently against the window. He thought about the room in Vancouver, the faces, the quiet courage, the way the candlelight had caught in their eyes. He hadn't given them answers. He'd just sat with them in the questions. And somehow that had been enough. He realized then that impact didn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looked like a teen finally sleeping through the night, because they heard someone say it's okay to rest. Sometimes it looked like a teacher playing an audio clip to a room of exhausted students and watching their shoulders drop. Sometimes it was as small as one person choosing to put their phone down and just breathe, and none of it required his name to be attached. In fact, the less it was about him, the more it seemed to help. He'd learned long ago that fame was a strange mirror. It reflected what people wanted to see, not who you really were. But in that community center, no one had looked at him through that mirror. They'd seen a person, and in return he'd offered the same. Now, as the audio continued its quiet journey across towns and time zones, it wasn't carrying his celebrity. It was carrying a message. You don't have to force your way through life. You don't have to have it all figured out. Stay in silence. Trust the process. Everything will occur naturally. He didn't know if that was true for everyone, but it had been true for him. And if it gave even one person permission to stop fighting themselves, then it was worth every quiet moment that led to it. Back on set the next morning, he arrived early. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the desert was painted in soft purples and golds. He stood for a while just watching. No phone, no plan, just presence. A crew member joined him after a few minutes, sipping coffee. They didn't talk. They just stood there side by side watching the light change. After a while, the crew member said softly, "Feels good to just be still, doesn't it?" Keanu smiled. "Yeah," he said. "It really does." And in that simple exchange, no audience, no recording, no agenda was the whole point. Not performance, not perfection, just two humans sharing a moment of quiet understanding. That was the real ripple, not the downloads, not the shares, but the quiet moments between people that no one would ever see, but that changed everything anyway. And Keanu, more than anyone, knew how to honor that. By saying nothing, by doing nothing, by simply being there, fully, quietly, naturally. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer the world isn't your voice, it's your silence. By late autumn of 2025, the phrase, "Stay in silence and everything will occur naturally," had become something quietly woven into the fabric of everyday life. Not as a slogan, not as a brand, but as a gentle reminder passed from person to person, like a borrowed sweater or a handwritten recipe. It showed up in unexpected places, scribbled in the margins of a student's notebook, pinned to a community bulletin board next to lost cat flyers, whispered between friends during a late-night walk. No one owned it. No one tried to. It belonged to everyone who needed it. Keanu Reeves never claimed it. He never released a book with that title, never launched a podcast, never stood on a stage to repeat it for applause. In fact, if you asked him about it, he'd likely just shrug and say something like, "I was just talking." People heard what they needed to hear. And that was the truth. He hadn't set out to start a movement. He'd simply shown up as himself in a room full of hurting hearts and spoken from a place of honesty. The rest had unfolded on its own, like leaves falling when the wind is right. But the ripples kept spreading, not through algorithms or marketing, but through human connection. In a small town in Ohio, a group of high schoolers started something they called silent walks. Every Wednesday after school, they'd meet at the edge of the woods behind the football field and walk together for 20 minutes. No phones, no music, no talking. Just footsteps on dry leaves and the sound of their own breath. At first, only 3 or 4 showed up. By November, there were over 30. Teachers noticed the kids seemed calmer on Wednesdays. Less restless. More present. One student later wrote in a college essay, "That silence didn't fix my anxiety, but it gave me a place to put it down for a while." Meanwhile, in Lisbon, a nurse who'd listened to the audio clip during a break between night shifts began ending each of her 12-hour shifts with 5 minutes of quiet. She'd sit in the empty break room, close her eyes, and just breathe. After a few weeks, her coworkers started joining her. No one spoke. No one needed to. It became their ritual, a small act of reclaiming themselves after hours of giving everything to others. She never told Keanu about it. She didn't need to. The gesture had already done its work. Back in Vancouver, the community center continued its weekly gatherings. New faces came and went. Some stayed for months. Others came once and never returned, but left lighter than they arrived. The facilitators never mentioned Keanu by name anymore. They didn't have to. The spirit of what he'd shared, the trust in stillness, the permission to not have answers, had become part of the room's DNA. One evening, a teenager who'd been coming for weeks finally spoke up. I used to think silence meant I was failing, like I should be doing more, saying more, being more. But now I see it's where I find myself. That was the quiet legacy. Not fame, not followers, but the slow, steady return of people to themselves. Keanu, for his part, carried on with his life. He finished the film he'd been working on in New Mexico. He traveled to Paris for a few days to visit an old friend. He spent a weekend helping a neighbor fix a leaky roof, refusing payment, saying, "I've got time." He still avoided the spotlight when he could. Still wore the same worn boots. Still gave up his seat on the subway. Nothing flashy. Nothing for show. Just consistent, quiet kindness, the kind that doesn't need recognition to be real. He never checked how many times the audio had been shared. He didn't read the articles that called him the philosopher of our time or the quiet hero of modern empathy. He knew those labels were projections, people trying to make sense of something that couldn't be boxed or branded. What he'd offered wasn't wisdom. It was witness. And witness doesn't need a stage. One rainy afternoon in October, he found himself back in Big Sur. Not for long, just a few days between projects. He stayed in the same cabin, though the owner had repainted the porch and added a new rocking chair. Everything else was the same. The smell of pine, the distant crash of waves, the way the fog curled around the treetops like smoke. He walked the same trails, sat on the same rocks, watched the same cove where seals sometimes gathered at dusk. And as he sat there, wrapped in a thick sweater, steam rising from a mug of tea, he thought about how little he'd actually done. He hadn't saved anyone. He hadn't changed the world. He'd just been honest in a room full of strangers. And somehow that honesty had traveled through headphones, through classrooms, through hospital break rooms, carried not by him, but by the people who needed it most. That was the thing about silence, he realized. It wasn't passive. It was fertile. Like soil waiting for seeds. You didn't have to force growth. You just had to stop disturbing it. Let the rain come. Let the sun rise. Let life do what it does best, unfold. He thought about the teens in Vancouver, the nurse in Lisbon, the kids walking through the woods in Ohio. None of them knew each other, but they were connected, not by him, but by a shared understanding that healing doesn't always come from noise. Sometimes it comes from stillness, from the courage to stop, to listen, to trust that you're exactly where you need to be, even in the mess. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet, Keanu closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The wind carried the scent of salt and earth. Somewhere far off, a bird called, and in that moment he felt it again, the same peace he'd felt in that community center months earlier. Not because everything was perfect, but because he wasn't trying to fix it. He knew the world would keep spinning. There would be more noise, more pressure, more demands to perform, to produce, to prove. But he also knew something else now. That silence was always available. Not as an escape, but as a home. A place to return to when the world got too loud. And the beautiful thing? You didn't need permission to go there. You didn't need a cabin in the woods or a famous voice to guide you. You just needed to stop for a breath, for a minute, for an afternoon, and let life move through you instead of against you. Later that night, back in the cabin, he wrote one last line in his notebook. The river doesn't announce its arrival. It just arrives. He closed the book and placed it on the shelf with the others. No plan to publish it. No intention to share it. Just another marker on the path. The next morning, he packed his bag, left a thank you note for the owner, and drove back to the city. On the way, he passed a young couple sitting on a roadside bench, not speaking, just watching the sunrise together. He smiled to himself. They didn't need words. They had silence. And in that silence, everything was already happening. Naturally, gently, exactly as it should. Back in his apartment, he unpacked slowly. Washed his clothes, made soup. That evening, he called an old friend just to hear their voice. They talked about nothing important. Weather, a book they'd read, a memory from 20 years ago. No agenda, no urgency. Just connection. And as he hung up, he stood by the window, looking out at the city lights flickering to life, and felt a deep, quiet gratitude not for being seen, but for being allowed to be human, flawed, uncertain, present. Because in the end, that's all any of us really want, to be seen not for what we do but for who we are. And to know that who we are, quiet, messy, searching, is enough. Keanu never gave another speech like the one in Vancouver. He didn't need to. The message had already taken root, in classrooms, in hospitals, in bedrooms where someone pressed play on a voice memo and finally felt less alone. And though his name was sometimes attached to it, the truth was the words had long since outgrown him. They belonged to the nurse who breathed before her shift, to the teen who walked in silence through the woods, to the teacher who played the audio on a hard day, to anyone who'd ever felt broken and needed permission to just be. That was the real story, not the fame, not the quotes, but the quiet everyday acts of courage that happened when people chose stillness over noise, presence over performance, trust over control. And Keanu? He just kept living it, step by step, breath by breath, in silence and in service, letting life unfold exactly as it should.